Thank you very much, Paula. Any question from the floor? If there is, you have to use, please, the microphone.
I would make, because I'm not an expert, I'm also not an expert in biometrics and all these things, maybe...
Introduce yourself,
Yes,
please.
Ángel Rodríguez Peña, Spanish Research Council biomedicine researcher, but interested in how you are measured on the way through your career. My question is related to the new trend of open access, not open access in the terms of being open and all of that, but in the trend of that the scientists might start to publish their results in the web, in online, I would not say journals, but I would think in more like a kind of Wikipedia. You publish your results, your results can be reviewed, your results can be grow and change in a much more cooperative way. And that way, how could you change, I mean, if that will affect, you make a body of studies about how to measure these type of things using biometric studies and impact factor, that will not be completely overstepped in 5-10 years when the science will be done in a different manner, which maybe we are able to overrun all the editorial straitjacket that now we have in front of us.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I've been part of several discussions with NIH, et cetera, under open access and trying and changes. And it's, of course, a very positive move for science, and we don't yet know how it's going to impact everything. I will say that there's just, I'm quite sure there will be a way very quickly to quantify how these open access journals are accessed and viewed and how many times they're viewed. And knowing how Elsevier likes to quickly figure out how to make a profit in this space, I suspect that we will quickly find new measures will be offered to people. But I think it's a remarkably positive step, particularly for young researchers, to be able to get their research out. And it's been, at least in the committees I sit on in the US, it's been a major concern that now they're, you know, in economics, sometimes it takes us 3 years to get a paper published. That revise and resubmits are generally, one often gets 2 and sometimes 3, and there can be 6 months between each of them. So I'm in a discipline that used to long lags, but the biomedical sciences historically didn't have that long a lags. And one thing that's also been disconcerting is that for younger people, the lags have seemed to have gotten longer between submission and actual publication. And open access also seems to address that, don't you think? That helps people get their research out earlier. That should help. So I think it's too early to know, but I think it's certainly a very positive move. But I do suspect it will become quantified some way, and we'll be seeing ways to get measures of that rather quickly.
So not just everything will be able to be quantified.
I think that's true.
That sometimes it can be quantified.
Oh no, and you know altmetrics. I mean, are some of you in here familiar with altmetrics? I mean, altmetrics have become very hot in looking at how many times research is mentioned in the press or how many times people have been interviewed on television or whatever regarding their research.
Laura Cruz from the TESIC. One of the main messages of your talk is that junior researchers are in a great disadvantage because of the way the metrics are being used in the grant proposal reviews and also in hiring and promotion decisions, and you suggest that as a way out that materials and publications should be read instead of counted. I mean that, as we all know, is time-consuming for panels. But what I wanted to ask is, what is your opinion of the calls and agencies that do 2 tracks for junior and senior, 2 tracks of taking into account the career stage of the PI, of the principal investigator, or even in the hiring and promotions, that they introduce an age criteria or a stage of career criteria, let's say years since PhD or things like that. Does this make a difference, or in your experience, the committees tend to make the same mistakes? Like, this is supposed to be thought to avoid treating juniors as seniors, or making them compete with researchers at very different career stages, but does it tend to again evolve, like making the usual mistakes?
So I think that's a great question. My experience with this is primarily at the National Institutes of Health. So the National Institutes of Health has been very concerned that the average age of the recipient of a first grant, in other words, the first time you get a grant, has risen from around age 36 to age 42 over the last 20 years. That's a dramatic increase, all right? And for physician PhDs, it's increased even more. I could send you data on this if you're interested. So this has been a major concern. Now, there was some concern about this even in the early 1990s, and NIH addressed it in the 1990s by having a totally separate program for young researchers, that you went in and you were reviewed separately. And I was not very involved at NIH at that time, but that was abandoned, in partly, I think, because it lacks, I'm not sure, but lacks status or some issues. There's a 1998 report that I could go back and look at that talks some about that. But they were young researchers were put back in with everybody. And so this is what I know the most about, is what are called R01s. R01 is the bread and butter grant of NIH. It's how about the majority of NIH money is spent. And an R01 grant lasts for between 3.5 and 5 years and is worth a little more than $1 million, all right? And you get the funding each year for this period of time. So it was decided that, although there were some special grants for like 1 year funding, young researchers were encouraged, and remember, these people aren't that young at this point. We're talking about people who are 37, 38, 39, early career stage people, were to compete with regular people, and they were. And it became very disconcerting to see that their scores were not nearly as strong and that they were having a hard time in grant review. And I think there was a real concern that part of it was bibliometrics, and part of it just was that they didn't have as thick of vitas, etc. So Elias Zerhouni, who was the director of NIH under George Bush, Zerhouni introduced a program that gave young investigators an extra score break. So it's like golf. The lower the score, the better. But you could get funded with a higher score. There was a break for first-time investigators. So you got it once in your career, basically. And that really did a lot for changing the age distribution, all right? So it was the same criteria, but you just changed where the cutoff was for young researchers. And by the way, it was very political in the sense that when the Great Recession happened in 2008, 2009, and NIH got this $10 billion more money for research grants, that was only for 2 years of funding, and a lot of young researchers refused to put in for those grants because they didn't want to use up their one trump card okay, on a 2-year grant. They wanted to save it for a 5-year grant, so people are very strategic about how they think about this. And that seemed to work. But now the thing that seems to have happened is over time that seems to have been eroded, okay? And it's not quite clear, but we've watched the age distribution start to come back up. And part of it is, of course, NIH funds have been going down, so success rates have been going down. So, and I really can't tell you whether it's that people learned and began to game it, but it's worth looking at in more detail. Now, the committee I'm on that will release our report next May, that's chaired by the current president of Johns Hopkins University, our committee will make a recommendation, which I'm not at liberty to talk about at this point, that will address young researchers again. So I think that people are really aware, at least in funding, that it's an issue and that we've tried different ways, but the jury is still out as to whether we found the best way to do it. Now, I really feel for hiring that there's no excuse not to look at people's papers when you're hiring junior faculty. I mean, or at least read extended abstracts of their research. I just think it's crazy to look at somebody who's just getting their PhD or just leaving a postdoc position and only look at their bibliometrics. I mean, it's not that thick a packet, and I really think we need to invest our resources. Besides that, it's the only way you're going to think about whether you want to work with somebody in a team and whether they're a good match for you. You're not just buying something here, it's an investment for your institution.
I think Vincenzo, on that, Vincenzo had the, or you had the, sorry.
No, it's a different one.
Okay. I saw.
Hi, well, I'm Vincenzo Paone from CSIC, from the same institution, and first of all, I want to tell you that I really enjoyed your presentation, and I enjoyed very much that you answered all the questions I had while you were presenting, except one. Except one, which is a more background question, and it's related to what has been discussed so far. I don't think it's an accident that science was more risk-taking when there was no bibliometrics. I mean, these two things may be unrelated or maybe not. What I mean is that, and we all know this when we make an application for Horizon 2020, we are no longer doing science there. We are trying to develop something for someone who is asking. It's more like trying to win a bid for public procurement than actually doing science.
Right.
And those who had proposal from FP7 or FP6, like me, I know the difference is pretty big. So the background question is really if whether bibliometrics was encouraging risk aversion was certainly an empirical question that you answered very well. But conceptually, from STS, from Science Technology Studies, we had this clear. Conceptually, it's meant to produce risk aversion. In fact, the point there is that the very activity of measuring per se, whatever is the measure, is conservative, is encouraging risk aversion. So you were asking at the end, and that's my proposal, the part of the proposal of the question, how do we conceptualize, or how do we measure risk? I'm not a quantitative scholar. From a qualitative point of view, what I think could be considered a good measure of novelty, of risk-taking, is when you reframe the problem you're trying to address in a completely different way. That would be, it requires a qualitative work, but I mean, if you conceptualize the problem, whatever that is, pollution, contamination, energy consumption, whatever, from a completely different perspective. For example, energy not as a problem of production, but as a problem of consumption. Or in this case specifically, instead of trying to develop a new measure, why don't we try to develop incentive to make people read the thing they're going to evaluate? So that is the question.
I think your comment stands on its own. A very good point. Go ahead.
Okay, Clara Eugenia Núñez, de la UNED. Well, let me begin by saying that I enjoyed your presentation and that I am all for measuring and hard data, but I am well aware of the problems that it may pose, and as it is in this case. You've mentioned the implication of measuring for the universities, for research funding, for many things, but I don't see, maybe I miss it, whether you consider whether it is influencing the way papers get published. Are the journals, scientific journals, using this kind of metric to decide who to publish or not? As a one-time editor, I found surprising that the best and novel articles submitted were the hardest to get published, because the reviewers were very harsh on them. It was something new, it was something that has to be proved beyond all the requirements that were applied to run-of-the-mill papers that came out very easily. And since you suggested that the top papers were less novelty-oriented than the second tier, I was wondering whether something like this was already present and feeding back into the system.
No, I think it's a very good comment, and my suspicion is that you're absolutely right. I mean, I think editors care, first of all, editors increasingly care about their impact factor, all right? I mean, we know that. And we know editors, we have lots of examples of editors that encourage authors to cite the journal in which it's being published, and we know why they're doing that, right? It's to boost their impact factor, right? And we know that happens. And I think we also, and this goes back to the relationship here of some interdisciplinarity, we know that editors, it's hard for them to think of reviewers outside their narrow field, so they send them to the same people, and they also are, I think, quite risk averse, the editors, and that it's very hard for them. They're afraid of failure also. And I'm also quite aware that some fields of science have professional editors, and some fields, like in my discipline of economics, don't have professional editors. So, for example, I think it was somewhat of a wake-up call for me. For 6 years now, I've served on the board of reviewing editors of the journal Science. So I get several manuscripts from Science every week to look at. And all the editors I interact with are professional. That's their job. They're full-time at Science, just like the person who I worked with at Nature is full-time at Nature. At the American Economic Review, the person who manages the queue is full-time, but the editor is a faculty member. And I think these are different incentives in some sense. And I've actually been encouraging people in science policy to think about how this alters the fields. And I will say, it's happened to me in my role at Science to get an email from an editor at Science saying, Paula, did you look at Nature this week? Why did Nature get that article? Why didn't we get that article? All right? And there's a lot of competition and a lot of concern about how much media attention they're going to get. And it's not necessarily clear that that encourages risk-taking necessarily. And also, I think it's very clear that editors become quite attached to papers. Maybe you have, okay, and quite unattached to other papers. And when they have problems with review, you can quickly become unattached. I think it's a very important question, and I think it's important to get more journals to release their data so that we understand more clearly these patterns. And I just think it's very hard for editors to think more outside their box in getting reviewers.
Thanks. I'm Luis Corchon, Professor of Economics at Charles III University. I enjoy your talk, but I am a little bit skeptical that novelty is the unique value we should look at. For instance, what is the novelty of this paper on proving the Fermat-Last conjecture? It's very little, right? There are like trillions of papers on Fermat-Last conjecture, but this is a very important paper because it provided the first proof. There are many other examples. In economics, we have the famous papers by Arrow and Debré. I mean, everybody has been talking about competitive equilibrium since the 19th century, but they were the first to provide, like a clean picture of the properties of competitive equilibrium. In my mind now, there are other examples like the famous paper by Crick and Watson on DNA. Everybody at this time was publishing something on the structure of DNA, but it turns out that they were wrong, and these two guys actually, thanks to possibly the picture by this woman in King's College, I don't remember now the name, but thanks to this, they actually were able to see what was the right, but the novelty was, not really very much, right? So perhaps we should.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more strongly. I think there's no way that I want to sell this research as this is the ultimate measure or the one measure we should have. I really think it's important to think of this research as an example of just looking at one possible measure of novelty or one possible measure of thinking differently or combinatorial views. And I really think as a field, we need to move forward in other ways. You have to understand that I was not initially all that enthusiastic about this way of doing it. Reinhilda's a very good salesperson, and the more I got involved, the more I really think there's something important here, but I don't think it's the only measure, and I really, really think we need to think much more in this kind of space.
Sara degli Esposti from Coventry University, and I would like to point out the issue of short-terminism, because this is something, the way that in business, especially in business studies, there are other studies that it is related to risk aversion. Okay, that's what's going on nowadays in business, is that what we tend to do is to have a short-term vision of our objectives and then take decision on base of this short time frame we apply to our decision making. Okay, so what you're observing in research policy is probably a broader trend we observe in general in organization studies, where we complain about, for example, there are studies on Hollywood, how producers decide to finance the next movie, okay? And they find the same evidence, so the same kind of attitude to try, so the same producer always tend to fund the same kind of movie, because so there is this path dependency,
right. Okay?
So for me, my intervention is more an invite to look in other areas of business, besides, because what's going on in science, I think it's more the privatization of science. So what we see are business practices applied in the field of science. So business practices like human resource practices apply to scientists. So, but these practices are more general and come from the private sector, and how the private sector is nowadays managed.
Well, I'm somewhat smiling because Louis and I were on a panel at the OECD exactly 4 weeks ago today, I think, in which my topic was basically short-termism and a decline of basic research and funding for basic research in the public sector, and tied it somewhat into what's going on in the private sector. So, I mean, I would agree with you in many ways, okay? But And I do think there's some overlap here, but I also think there's some things specific to science. And one of the things that I think is very specific to science is that the scale of science has just grown so much. Some of you may know that, at least in the US, we went on this path of supporting university researchers through grants. It really began in 1947 with Vannevar Bush's publication of Science, the Endless Frontier. And so in 2012, to celebrate, what would it have been? Anyway, the 70th anniversary or whatever of this report, now, because of when it was started, Adam Jaffe and Scott Stern organized an NBER group in which we were fortunate to have Kenneth Arrow still there and talk about his research at it and to look at really the impetus for the way we started funding science. And I was asked to kind of write the historical chapter about how this all played out. And one of the things that was so intriguing to me is I got all kinds of documents from NIH from the late 1940s, in which once NIH was given money, nobody applied, all right? And in which directors talked about how one director drove 200,000 miles in 1 year, going from campus to recruit proposals and to convince people to apply to NIH for funding. It's retrospectively quite humorous, isn't it? That they, and as I say in this paper, you know, initially they had to convert campuses to wanting to have funding, but once campuses got converted, they tried to convert NIH to their way of doing business, et cetera. I mean, it's kind of interesting. So what I think really happened is also the scale changed. You know, it was a very, very small enterprise, and at the time it started, everybody knew everybody. So you sat down for panel review, and even if bibliometrics had been available, people, I don't think, would have looked at them because they all knew each other. They'd gone to the same graduate schools, they had the same mentors, they went to the same meetings. It was of a scale that was very manageable. So one thing that's happened is that the whole business of science has become more like a business because it's grown so much. And I think any time that anything takes on that much scale, and we were talking about this the other evening, the three of us over dinner, anytime anything takes on this much size, we're very tempted at quantifying and looking at rules and ways of doing things, okay? And so I think it's no surprise in a sense that we adopt some of these management behaviors or what, but it used to be a club activity, I would argue, almost exclusively a club activity, and it's changed remarkably over time. And I just think that it's important for us to think about how we can keep some of the good parts of having really read each other's work with increasing the size of it.
Pedro Noeda, Consejo del National Spanish Research. I would like to just a personal question about if do you have any results about metric analysis and measuring of novelty?
About the what? I'm sorry, I didn't.
About metric analysis,
Metric
analysis and measuring of novelty in bibliometrics.
Oh.
That's very important.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Speak, sorry for this personal question, but then I think that you can explain better how to match mathematical methods that we are using with limitation, with experience. If you have...
So you're asking how much this measure, if we just looked at bibliometric fields?
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't answer that question right now, but one of my co-authors can really answer that question. So I'll write Jean and see if I can get him. Now that he's moved to Leiden, he has access to all the flat files at Leiden. So I'll see if I can lure him into that, okay? And then I'll be in touch if I get an answer, all right?
Tienes que coger el...
Thanks, Paula, for the presentation from the paper, because it's very inspiring. I only would like to raise one doubt that relates to the links or the causal links between the analysis of the publications and the funding results. That means the policy consequences. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that what Vincenzo just said, that science was more risky taking when it was no bibliometric, is true. I had been reading papers from the 70s and the 80s in which the calls, Daryl Chubin, were complaining about the low risk taking of the NSF funding strategies at the time. That means even in the 60s and in the 70s, the issue was complaining. There were complaints about the performance of the peer review process. Then my point is, to what extent what you are measuring is one issue, that is novelty, and the way in which we could recognize novelty using bibliometric in a better way, but the core of the problem and the black box that you are not opening is in fact the procedures operating under the peer review processes. And this is what it matters. And my point is to what extent the substantive analysis of your paper, that is mainly bibliometrics, could not be improved by the significant amount of empirical evidence that we have on policy analysis regarding the operation of peer review processes. And because it's the incentives that the actors playing in the game of reviewing what it determines the risk aversion, is not the way of measuring. At the end, this is what it matters. There are enough evidence to say that, and practitioners perfectly know, that when you define the number of areas for evaluation, you are shaping the results. When you define the disciplinary composition of a panel, you are completely shaping and biasing the results. I mean, this is practice, everyday practice that people know. And there are enough empirical evidence to say that the best predictor of the risk aversion is the composition of the panels. There are enough evidence of analysis all over Europe. Then why not to move the discussion to why we have a secting, why I will call a sickness or a disease in the peer review procedures of the funding agencies, and even the journals are operating in that wrong way. Probably the main driver is the massification. Of course, this is something that should be taken on board. But what it should be changed probably is the instruments for funding and also the procedures for operation. And this is the global statement. What do you think it could be done to introduce the operation of peer review in the whole analysis? And I have two technical questions regarding the measurement. The first one relates to the definition itself of the novelty. And the definition of the novelty is a relation between pairs of journals. And my point is, you need, and the novelty of the co-citation of pairs of journals is dependent of the age of the journals. That means you need to have a journal at least alive for more than 20 or 25 years to get this kind of association, because the probability of having novelty will be dependent on the age of the journals that are co-cited. And this is one point I don't know how you deal. And the other one, it's related to the definition of the fields or the areas of research, because you have been using, I think it's 256 areas, and the composition, and you mentioned in the paper that the degree of innovativeness of biological sciences is higher than in the physics, and is an artifact of the measurement tools, because the number of biological the number of fields associated to biological sciences is much higher than the number of fields associated to physics and engineering. Then to what extent this measurement question of novelty is not biased by the way of you frame the data.
So let me just address the last 2 points very quickly. Age of journals, we played with that, and I think that's not what's driving these results, because we can do it with journals that have only been around for 20 years or whatever, and you get very similar results. And I would argue that what you just said about it being that, yes, the biomedical fields are in more categories, but that's not what's driving our results here, because we're not picking up whether it's out of your field, it's whether the pair has ever been made before, okay? I completely agree that there's been lots of concern about risk-taking for years, and I've read, I think, everything Daryl Chubin has written on this in the past, but I would say that I think he's absolutely wrong about at least early years at NSF. Early years at NSF, they were funding 65% of all proposals, and it's a little hard to argue that people were just cherry-picking safe research at a 65% funding rate. So, I mean, we really have seen major changes. But I completely agree that who serves on panels is extraordinarily important. And I think this has been and who reviews is extraordinarily important. And this is a major problem for funding agencies. And NIH had such a big problem that people were turning them down to be on panel. You know, you're on a study section, you're assigned to be on a study section for several years, and it's a lot of work. So what they found out is that highly funded people were saying, no, thank you, I'm too busy with my research, and I'm not going to serve on it. And there was a real bias, I think, in expertise. So NIH changed its incentives. And what they said is, if you have 2 grants from us and you understand a successful senior person has 2 to 3 grants, you have to serve on a study section. You have no choice about this, okay? You are going to do it. And furthermore, when you're finished doing it, you get 6 months of additional funding, all right? But it had become a real problem of recruiting senior people. Now, whether senior people are exactly the right people, that's a whole nother question. I mean, I think that's a big problem, but it was a problem that at least people it became very, very clear that it was becoming way too easy to get out of it. So I completely think a lot of what you're saying is we've met the enemy and he's us, okay? But I also agree with what you said about the way you structure things will depend on what you get into it. Although both of these programs, both NSF and NIH, and ERC tries to do this to invite innovative, creative proposals, and NIH has a very special called Pioneer Award, you know, but they only fund 20 of them a year, all right? So it's peanuts. I mean, we're going to take on risk by inviting people to spend 6 weeks of their life writing a proposal that has less than a 1% chance of getting funded. I don't think that's a very good investment if you're a young researcher. And NSF did the same kind of thing. So I do think it's important to think about how we're structuring these. I'll be quiet. It must be lunchtime.
Any more questions? No? Well, thank you very much. We can continue the conversation. If any of you want to join for lunch, we are going to try to find a place to fit in. And thank you all for this idea.
Thank you very much for hosting me and for the great questions. I really enjoyed it.